And today we have the special honor of focusing with Evaggelos Vallianatos, who is just back from Greece after taking a long trip and having a long flight home with a lot of coughing and crying. So he may be a little tired, but Evaggelos has so much energy. We will enjoy his burst of enthusiasm about Greek history. The title of his session today is Freedom, Clear Thinking and Inspiration from 5,000 Years of Greek History. This is the title of his book, which is brand new, and so we're getting an opportunity to get a peek at his new book. The session today and the sessions throughout October continue in our series, Forging Paths Toward Justice, Peace, and Earth Care. Now let me say some things about Evaggelos, who is a fascinating man. He is a man, a true Renaissance man. Evaggelos is known for his work in Greek history and the natural world. He's been working in both of those areas for a number of years. You see, he already carries forth this transdisciplinary vision of John Cobb. He studied zoology, ancient Greek, and medieval Greek history at the University of Illinois, then earned a PhD in Greek and European history at the University of Wisconsin, and then pursued postdoctoral studies in the history of science at Harvard. I share this because I want you to be aware of his deep roots in more than one subject area and his ability to weave things together. He worked on Capitol Hill for 2 years and then in the Environmental Protection Agency for 25 years. There he worked especially in risk evaluation. His passion for environmental protection can be found in many of his articles and books, including 3 that I'll name here: Harvest of Devastation, This Land is Their Land, and Poison Spring. He continues his significant work now as an independent scholar, and among his books on Greece is one that he wrote a few years ago, The Passion of the Greeks, Christianity and the Rape of the Hellenes, and his latest book on freedom, which he will introduce to us today. We are so lucky to have you, Evaggelos. Thank you so much for being with us, and we're all eyes and ears on you.
Thanks. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mary Elizabeth, and thanks very much for everybody else who is attending. I'm a historian primarily, and of course an ecopolitica theorist. I mean, I have done both in both areas, and I merged them because I think there's a connection. The Greeks not only highlighted us and guided us to science and technology, but also focus us to illustrate the importance of the natural world and the earth in particular, for the Greeks, of course, the earth herself was a goddess. And according to Plato, she was the oldest of the gods. What you see in this icon is the face of Athena, the daughter of Zeus. And I found this picture in the Library of Congress, done by an American artist in 1897. And it's one of the most beautiful paintings or icons of Goddess Athena. And I will focus on Goddess Athena to some degree. I think the whole of Greek history is between a kind of a quest, freedom or death. And in ancient times and in modern times, the Greek people have faced that dilemma. Do we live on our knees and therefore be enslaved to somebody, or we fight to death, fight to the last man, as the ancient Greeks had decided to do it, and when the Persians invaded Greece in 490 and 480 BC. And Aeschylus, one of the greatest of the tragic poets, urged them never to live on their knees. So you can imagine. Here we see the icon of the School of Athens by Raphael at the center, where we see the two masters, both Plato and Aristotle. And on the right side, we have goddess, rather the icon of Hellas of Greece at the Battle of Mesologi in 1825-26, when the Greek Revolution was practically expired. And she represents that possibility. Here is my favorite goddess, Athena, on the left and right, different versions of Athena, but the same goddess. The key about this particular deity is that she represented more than just a goddess. She was freedom, she was democracy, intelligence. Her mother, Metis, was the goddess of intelligence. So you can imagine being the child of the mother of intelligence, of the goddess of intelligence. So she was bright and forthright and guiding Athenians throughout their history. And the Athenians, of course, honor her so much that they built that beautiful building, the Parthenon. And just a few days ago, I was in the Parthenon, and I not only I looked at the building and I took a lot of pictures, but looking at the visitors, the so-called tourists, admiring the columns and whatever survives from that great temple, and looking at them individually, taking pictures of themselves and having as a background the Parthenon. It seems to me this is a fantastic kind of a global Philhellenic opportunity, and about which I have written, and I have urged the Greek government to do something about it, but I don't know. It's a big problem. But anyway, they represent the greatest friends of the country of Greece, these tourists that go there by the thousands. They figured there were 22,000 tourists per day visiting the Parthenon, and now they're trying to diminish it to 20,000. So we're talking about a huge crowd, and I'm delighted that they have the inspiration and the love to go visit this great temple. Here is Eros, but this Eros is different than what we understand as Eros. This is a creative force in the development of the universe itself. So Eros, at least for the early poets, was the force that kept the universe together. So, and supposedly this god had Aphrodite as a mother, but that's not really true, because this Eros is much older than Aphrodite. On the left, I have the Aphrodite of Milos on the very left. A beautiful statue of Aphrodite that the French stole from the island of Milos, and they have it in the Louvre. And the second, we have an icon of one of the chorus or young women on the Acropolis. And on the right is another version of Aphrodite, but she's found in Asia Minor, and she's a product of Praxiteles in the 4th century BCE. And of course, on the very right, we have the modern version of Aphrodite being born out of the foams of the sea. Now, on the very left, we have Zeus, the father of the gods. He's terribly important. I know we live in a Christian society, and we think this is all mythology, but that was not true for the Greeks. These were very fundamental forces in nature and in organizing their society. So Mr. Zeus here, they have him in Olympia, where they have the Olympic Games, and the games were devoted to him or given to him. And therefore, he was a big deal. This is a divine being of enormous time span and influence in Greek politics, religion, and culture. On the middle, we have Zeus holding his weapon. And on the very right is a picture I took in central Greece, where it's an abandoned temple of Zeus. If you can imagine a Greek ministry of culture abandoning something that was a temple of Zeus. But things like this happen all the time. Here we have the 4 gentlemen that created the weapon of Zeus. On the very left, we have, of course, Apollo. This is a god of light, music, and of course, everything that comes under that. And then we have Hephaestus, god of technology and metallurgy, and then the 4 Cyclops, the first 4 engineers that manufactured this weapon for Zeus. So from there we moved to Dionysus, and Dionysus was extremely important. He was also son of Zeus, and he's supposed to have represented wine, good time, tragedy, theater, especially theater. And we can see the theater and Epidavros in the middle. And you have another version of his face when he was in the fancy dancing orgy with all sorts of menads, women mad in passion for him, and having a really a great time. I wish I were part of that group. And here we have what I think is one of the greatest of the divinities of the Greek pantheon, and this is Dimitra. My grandmother, by the way, she was called Dimitra. So I have a special affection for Dimitra. She was the goddess of wheat. And you can imagine between wheat and the olive tree, which was a gift of Athena, I forgot to mention that, you have the Greek rural economy. So Dimitra was extremely important because of her supervision and blessings of farming and agriculture. And she was also the sister of Zeus, it helped quite a bit in that. And here now I'm moving to the very ancient times. On the left is Neolithic, that's over 6,000 years BCE. Look at the beauty of this vase. I mean, it's just extraordinary. In the middle you see a spiral in the middle. I think this is probably the vision of what they had when they looked up at the sky, the universe. What was this universe made up? And this is 6,000 BC. On the right, we have another picture of a beautiful temple, but it's much newer. It's 1,500 BC from the island of Milos. And just I wanted you to admire the beauty of this, the design. And these things were created, by the way, not to be put in museums. They were created for daily use. So, and now we move into the former Bronze Age, which starts with 3000 BC and ends up in 1000. So we have those 2000 years of Greek history in which I think they were the basis for the development of Greek civilization. That is, you find the early forms of architecture, the very foundations of which end up in its classical form, the Parthenon. You have the development of design. You have the development of ideas, though we don't have the speech much of any kind of writing, because during this time they had linear B, that is a kind of a graphic form of writing that was deciphered much later in the 50s as an early form of Greek. But nevertheless, you can see from the pictures I have of this treasures that they were not exactly very far behind what we hope that we would ever accomplish. On the very top right, you have a young man or woman, I don't know what it is, playing music, a harp. I mean, I would like you to just simply admire the beauty of this thing. And look at the woman, the dresses, how they were dressed, the design, the model, the art of the craftsmanship that must have gone into their clothes. Again, the same thing. This is Minoan Crete. The island of Crete is the largest of the Greek islands in the southern Aegean, and it's just beautiful. Again, look at the woman on the very top right. Have you seen any modern woman who is as beautiful as this one? I mean, just extraordinary. I cannot imagine. And then the other pictures illustrate the art and craftsmanship of that period, which is it's in the middle of the second millennium BCE, when Crete was governed by a son of Zeus called Minos, from which you have Minoan. And this is for the greatest achievements of that time. On the very left, this is a beautiful picture of something that an astronomer, formal astronomer, he calls it a lithic mechanism of the heavens. So they must have designed something. I have not seen it in person. I have only seen the picture, but this is where they probably focused to understand the stars and to understand what time is. How do you put the time together in versions, human beings and the earth? And on the right is some British archaeologists at the British Museum took these pieces from walls of the palaces and put them together and showed some sort of veneration of the gods. Here, this is of course it's related to the labyrinth, but it was also a coin, equivalent of a drachma. Again, on the very left, just focus for 1 second on the left, upper left. You have a furious bull, and you have two young men, athletes, obviously super athletes, and one of them is ready to grab the horns of the bull and jump over the bull. This is what they try to do in their own traditions. On the middle, we have probably the picture of a king of Crete, and there are the ruins of the temple of the palace at Knossos. And on the very right, you have, of course, some iconography of the decorations of the walls of the palace. Here on the very left, I took this picture. It just the interesting part about you can see these gigantic stones. Because they were gigantic stones, they assumed that Cyclops, meaning superhuman, powerful man, would have done something like this. But I'm not so sure about the Cyclops. I'm sure of the technology that they used to build this wall. And then again, you have these women. Focus for a second on the clothes. The model of these are women from Thebes. And then, of course, on the right side, you have Oedipus, the king, and talking to this creature, and he guessed what the creature wanted, so he managed to survive. On this iconography here, I have the one picture that illustrates the early writing of the pre-alphabetic Greek, but this is part of Greek, however. And then, of course, we have another beautiful woman and another illustration that is absolutely beautiful. And here's some more. I mean, these are all beautiful illustrations. Oh, here is something unique. Two archaeologists from the University of Cincinnati in Ohio spent almost 25 years of their lives in southern Peloponnesus in a city called Pylos. So they were, in 2015, they were fortunate enough, they dug up a kind of intact burial ground, and they found hundreds of items illustrated from this period of the Bronze Age. Silver, gold items, knives, earrings, and so on. And what was the most interesting was a tiny polished stone on which someone at that time, in 1450 BCE, designed what you see. This warrior killing two other warriors. Well, that's not exactly pleasant, but nevertheless, it shows the exquisite knowledge of anatomy. Look at the human body, how it is. And all this, by the way, now is being exhibited at the Getty Museum. And I'm going to try to find somebody to drive so I can go and see them in person. And now I start with saying a few things about three epics. One illustrated in the Argonauts, and two by Homer. To see that this Bronze Age not only produced exquisite treasures, but they had also some written way of describing whatever was important to them in that particular age. The Argonaut is called Argonautica, which is an epic on the exploration of the so-called Black Sea by 50 young male Greeks who left Thessaly to go all the way to what is today the state of Georgia, then named as Colchis. And they went there and they managed to return home the golden fleece. But in addition to that, they brought more knowledge about metallurgy, more knowledge about the seacoast of the Black Sea, Evaggelos for the Greeks, and where they colonized later on. And by the way, since I speak about colonization, let me make one point. That ancient Greece, of course, from what I said, it was not a Christian country. And number two, ancient Greece was not one particular polis that controlled everything. No. In the middle of the 5th century BC, we have around 2,000 different states, Greek states, all speaking Greek, all worshiping the gods and so on. And So they had more or less control of the whole of the Mediterranean. There were Greek polis in southern France, Greek polis in southern Spain. In Italy, from Naples down to Sicily was all Greek for several hundred years, and the Romans themselves call it Magna Graecia. And then you have the Black Sea, uh, and then you have North Africa. So altogether, you have pretty much most of the Mediterranean controlled by independent Greek states. So to get all these people together was almost impossible. So they created the Olympics and other Pan-Hellenic Games so that the athletes would go and compete, but then at the same time they would have a chance to talk to each other and get to know each other. In fact, Herodotus, who wrote the history of the Peloponnesian War, he went to one of these Olympics and he read his history. So that's how they did a book presentation then. And so it was, and then not only they had these games, but they also had the activities in the Delphi, with Apollo and his priestess that made predictions or answered questions and so on. So they had a number of, including their religious association and festivals, all of them to make them understand that they were the same people, and therefore they should not indulge into fight and civil wars. And unfortunately, they did not follow up that rectum completely, and they did fight civil wars. And as a result of that, the Greeks began to decline, and of course, they destroyed themselves eventually because of that. Okay, here's the Black Sea, or the Greeks call it the Wakam Sea, or Euxynos Pontus. And here we have Achilles, the greatest Greek hero in the Trojan War. The Trojan War was the first Greek civil war. As you remember, if you read the Iliad or the Odyssey, you can see the other guys, they speak Greek, they worship Greek gods, both the Greeks and the Trojans. They have similar names and so on. So here we see Achilles eating meat after he had killed Hector, the greatest hero of the Trojans, because he himself had killed his friend Patroclus. So it's the key idea here is that war makes humans barbarians. There's no other expression I can use to to illustrate what happens during the time of war. And we know that from many wars of this country and other countries as well. Here is our greatest of the ancient Greek poets. This is Homer. And, in reading Homer, you don't just read about mythology. You read history, you read philosophy, you read politics, you read astronomy, cosmology, all of the above. And I'm astonished that there are some modern scholars who pretend to be classical scholars who deny the very existence of Homer. It's just like you deny there were ancient Greeks. Because this guy, his Iliad and the Odyssey made up the written material, the singing material of hundreds of thousands of Greeks for centuries and centuries, to this very day almost. Homer was the teacher of the Greeks. So, and not only that, but if you want to find out that it's really he existed, take a look at Aristotle. Aristotle loves Homer. And in his philosophical and scientific works, he cites Homer repeatedly. He says, let me check and see what Homer did say about this. And he said, as I said, he cites Homer in the philosophical and scientific works he wrote. Now, solar eclipses in the Odyssey, I think book 20, somewhere that is Homer, talks about a solar eclipse that modern astronomers have dated to, not to the day or to the hour, but they have dated pretty much to the late, let's say late 13th century BCE or to the early part of the 12th century BCE. And here we see Athena creating the solar eclipse. And Homer himself about this, he says 2 lines, and I will simply recite it. He says, "Η έλεος δε ουρανού εξαπόλωλε, κακή δε επιδέδρομεν αχλής," which means the sun disappeared from the sky and a bad, omihli, meaning bad dark stuff attacked the earth, or something like this. And it was during this time that Odysseus had returned to Ithaca, and he began killing the people who bothered his wife. I mean, and this is another hero of extreme importance for the Greek people, because this guy was also the son of Zeus, and he devoted his entire life to doing good. no business, no private companies, nothing. Just doing good for anywhere he was wanted. And in the third picture on the upper side, you see Heracles. Unfortunately, his head is not there. But anyway, he joined the Argonauts. He went with the Argonauts. Okay. Here is again, the theory is that he also inspired and developed the Olympic Games in 776 BCE. But of course, because of what we know about him being in the Argonautic expedition, the date of the Olympic Games gets much longer, much older than 776 BCE. Here is what I said before about the Greeks dominating the Mediterranean. Wherever you see black, I mean red, you can see the Greek city polis all over the Mediterranean. Here is from a picture I took from a video about Greeks still speaking, I mean, Italian villages. Some peasants still speak Greek after all this a couple of thousand years ago in Magna Graecia. Sparta, I say a few things about Sparta. It was a military state, extremely powerful. It had a mixed constitution, included democracy, oligarchy, and priesthood. And they did pretty well for a number of years. I mean, they were the superpower of ancient Greece. There's no doubt about that. You have the complete force no one could defeat. And then the Athenians, of course, will focus on sea warfare. So that's how they managed to defeat the Persians. Here, I moved to some philosophy, and we're looking at the Nicaraguan postage stamp honoring Pythagoras. You remember him with the Pythagorean theorem. He was a mathematician, he was an astronomer, philosopher, cosmologist, and to me, equally important was he was a vegetarian. He urged his students, he had a school in Croton in southern Italy for 40 years. He urged his students never to kill a living being, never. He says, don't offer any burn any thighs from anything to the gods. The gods don't need to smell meat. Now we go to Athens, and in Athens we have Solon, this guy. After a turbulent 6th century, the Athenians were ready to fight a civil war. Why? Because the very wealthy farmers had enslaved these small-scale farmers, and they were selling them abroad. If you can believe that, Greeks selling Greeks as slaves outside of Greece. So the rest of his class, very wealthy Athenians, they invited him to come back. They say for 1 year you can legislate. So he did legislate. He abolished slavery completely. He made it impossible for anybody to even volunteer to become a slave because of debt. And in other words, he took the first steps for creating a democratic government in Athens. And this man completed the work of Solon, Clisthenes. He was a great legislator, and he had something to do with the strengthening of the court system. They had federal courts and state courts and local courts. I mean, if you were accused of a crime, you did not have a lawyer, you didn't have a judge, but you went to a place that you had 1,000 to 2,000 jurors, and you had to explain what was the crime of the opponent of the person you accused, and you had to be able to defend yourself. And then the jury decided then and there, yes or no on what you said. So it was a very interesting form of supporting democracy. And here, this picture illustrates the divine origin of democracy. On the left, you have Apollo, and then his daddy, Zeus. And on the very right, you have Hera, the wife of Zeus. So the idea is that they were making decisions together. So this is the beginning of democracy. Though Aeschylus in the 5th century claims that Athena gave the democratic idea to the Athenians. But anyway, whether it was Athena or Zeus or Apollo, it doesn't matter. It was the divine idea of creating something that people could work together and decide together. I mean, this is a lesson for our day today, I think. Direct democracy is probably the most interesting, the most precarious, but the most lively form of democracy. But democracy, demokratia, you give power to the people. That's what you do. That's why it's so dangerous. That's why people attack democracy. That's why, and you know what's happening right now in our country. Here we have, I quote a little bit Aeschylus, and he's telling the Athenians always to respect their parents, their foreigners who visited Greece, never to live in slavery, that is to live on their knees, respect foreigners, and then work the land. The best fruits of everything comes from the land. That is to respect farming and do work hard and produce their own food. And never resort to civil war. I mean, this is a fantastic idea for us, for everybody, and this is the Greek theater. This took place, of course, was presented in the theater of Dionysus, and the Athenians were so good about the theater that they paid even poor people to go to the theater. Why? Because the theater had become a school of freedom, school of freedom. And this is another lesson for us. Why can't we create schools of freedom? We call it political science at the universities. But what do the political scientists do today, for instance, with all these problems that we're facing? Write their papers, publish them in obscure journals? That won't really help us. Here, sometimes despite Aeschylus and despite Homer and all the other great, they resorted to war, unfortunately. And here is a version of what they did, resorting to war, going to war. And here, of course, is in the middle picture, we have a naked man who came back and he told the Athenians, "We won." This is on the Battle of Marathon. Here is 490 BC. The Athenians and some allies defeated a much larger Persian army. But they used strategy really to do that. I mean, just like Alexander the Great later on, where he faced massive foreign powers. He used strategy to defeat much larger armies. We have the philosopher on the very left saying, "War is the father and king of all." And regrettably, he probably is right, because look what's going on today. How many wars are going on as we speak? Quite a number of wars in Africa, Asia, Latin America, in Europe, in Ukraine, in Israel. I mean, slaughter is just a business as usual, so to speak. So it's unfortunate we have not learned what the Greeks taught us, and we pretend we love the Greeks and so on. At any rate, here we have Leonidas. We are now in 480 when the Persians have come back against Greece, and they have terrified the Greek city-states to the point that Thrace, Macedonia, and Thebes joined the Persians to fight against their own people, against Greeks. This is the Battle of Salamis, a small island next to Attica. And Herodotus tells us that Xerxes, he was a madman. He had a bridge built to join the two sides of the straits, and because the waves blew the bridge down, he ordered to beat the sea 300 times or so with something, and then he had all the people who created the bridge executed. So at any rate, that did not go very well, and the Greeks won. Fortunately, they won, and we are free, because the victories of the Greeks eventually not only helped the Greeks to survive much longer, but they helped them to keep the institutions which eventually became the foundations of Western civilization. And they had this idea of freedom of death. That's from Aeschylus, even before, in Homer. You cannot live the life of a slave and pretend that you can actually think or act or be energetic or do creative or invent or anything. Nothing. Freedom is absolutely essential for all the activities that you can imagine. If I was a slave, I would never be able to write a book or even to write an article and think that I'm going to survive. So freedom is absolutely the greatest of all the virtues. And this is a picture of the trireme of Athens that made it a formidable sea warfare state, and some pictures from the Battle of Salamis in 480 BC. And here is the hero of the Battle of Salamis. And regrettably, the Athenians and the Spartans conspire, and they exile the guy. He ended up going to Persia, and he died in Persia. So there were beautiful things about democracy in Athens, but there were some ugly things too. Democracies, you have a lot of people thinking and deciding at the same time. So we know something about democracy here, I suppose. Yeah. Pericles was the chief politician of Athens. He was a general. The generals were elected in Athens. So he kept repeatedly being elected for dozens of years. And he was more or less behind what they call the glory of Athens, or the golden age of science and technology in Athens in the 5th century, before the Peloponnesian War. And he was fundamentally responsible for the Peloponnesian War because he did not pay much attention to Sparta. As on the little temple on the left is absolutely a little beautiful temple that has survived. It's the temple of Nike, meaning victory. Oh, you might call it freedom. And on the right, of course, a picture of all of the Acropolis and the surviving whatever survives from Parthenon and other temples. Here is the Parthenon, and there was a minister of culture, Melina Mercouri, in the 80s. And she said the Parthenon is the soul of Greece. And I happen to agree with her. Here is the Peloponnesian War, 431 to 404. During all these 27 years, the Greeks slaughtered each other. They destroyed, they cut olive tree lawns, they wiped them out. In other words, they behaved like barbarians. There's no doubt in my mind about that. And the real reason for the civil war was one state, Sparta, began to be jealous and afraid of the rising power of Athens. So you might find similar positions about today, China and the United States. Is China afraid of the rising of the perpetual power or the global power of the United States? I cannot answer that question, but this is exactly what happened with Athens and Sparta. The fear of the rising power of the neighbor, this time Athens, caused the civil war. And here's another evidence of corruption. We have this handsome young man, Alcibiades. He was the student of Socrates. He was from a great family. He was appointed general in the war that they had against Syracuse in 414 BCE. And he ended up being recalled to face charges of religious impiety. And he said, I'm not going to go back to Athens. They're going to kill me if they have enough people against talking against me. So instead of returning to Athens, he went to Sparta. He advised the Spartans against the Athenians. And after that, he left Sparta. He went to Persia. And he said to the Spartans, I have advice for you. Keep funding Sparta to kill Athenians. Imagine, this is an Athenian guy, a very distinguished man, and so on, telling the Persians to keep killing Greeks. I mean, awful. Here's the man who wrote the Peloponnesian War, Thucydides, a fantastic work of historical narrative. I advise those of you who have the opportunity to read it. It's a beautiful book. But he left the 10 last years of the war untold because he must have been so heartbroken about this that he stopped writing the history. And another Athenian general and writer, Xenophon, ended completing the history of the Peloponnesian War. But he loved Athens, of course. He was Athenian, but he also had tremendous respect for Sparta. He couldn't, and the Athenians exiled him for 20 years. So he had plenty of time to go. He was a wealthy man. He was interviewing Athenian and Spartan generals, what happened there and why and so on. And we see all that in his great history. It's called The Histories. I mean, the history of the Peloponnesian War. And this is a young general, Athenian generals who ended up restoring democracy to Athens in 404 when the Athens. Now, this is a very interesting kind of an icon of a cave, and they call it Platonic cave, Plato's cave. And it does reflect our times. You have a few men chained, so they could not turn their heads around, and they were looking at images from the wall, and the images were coming from people in the back. They had some fire, and so through the light, the images were projected on the wall on the left. And those guys, because they couldn't move, they thought those images were reality. So if by accident one was free and went up over the cave, he would be blinded by the truth. In this case, the light. So it's something that's going on today. I mean, the people are talking about fake news and so on, and all the iPhones and television and so on. So it's a very kind of a philosophical reflection for us today to think, where are we now? And this is a beautiful temple in southern Italy. And it's just like it was built yesterday. It's a gorgeous building. Here I am citing Democritus, the man who invented the atomic theory, and the Greek says everything is made out of the atoms and void. The rest is just imaginary. So this theory, unfortunately, in the early part of the 20th century, became atomic bombs, and then eventually nuclear bombs. And here we have the School of Athens on the left, where we have Plato and Aristotle, and then Alexander, because Aristotle spent 20 years with Plato, but he developed his own ideas. He became a distinct philosopher of philosophy and science. I mean, he invented science as we know it. And of course, he became the teacher of this young king from Macedonia, Alexander. And therefore, not only that, but he edited the Iliad and the Odyssey of Homer, and he gave them as a gift to this prince Alexander before he became Alexander the Great. And therefore, Alexander fell in love with Homer and everything he said. So in his career, he tried to imitate, guess who? Achilles, the greatest hero of the Trojan War. So power moves in the 4th century from Socrates to Plato to Aristotle to Alexander the Great. I mean, we know that it's happening all the time. And here is a picture of Aristotle, a Greek woman painter painted this picture. And Aristotle, as I said already, he invented science. His philosophical works and then also his scientific works. He developed zoology as we know it. And he wrote 2 books about zoology and a book about meteorology. So he developed biology to some degree and meteorology. He was a genius. I mean, he was 2,000 years ahead of his time. And in the 18th and 19th century, they quoted him. And then not only that, but he was beloved by the Arabs. The Arabs in the 8th century, despite the fact that they were Muslims, they had a caliph who had fallen in love with Greek learning. So he sent his agents to Constantinople, the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire or Greek Empire, and they made copies of the philosophical and scientific works of the Greeks. He took them to Baghdad and they translated them into Arabic, and then they developed their own scientific enlightenment. And they made contributions to medicine, to optics, and then because they controlled Spain, in Cordoba, Spain, they had a school, and therefore the Europeans began to get some idea about Aristotle and Archimedes and other ones from Cordoba, Spain, through the Arabs. And then, of course, later on in the 15th century, when Byzantium collapsed under the Mughal Turks, the Greeks left with everything that they had. They went to Italy, and they sparked in that way the other major scientific renaissance in the West. Here's where Aristotle is teaching zoology to the students. Here is Aristotle defeating the Persians, and so on. In other words, Aristotle, yeah, he was a conqueror, but he had been a student of Aristotle. Alexander, I'm talking about, yeah. But he had a vision of his head, like he wanted to create an ecumeny, meaning a kind of a planetary school of thought. That he would be, of course, the top manager, but he was telling the Persians, I am your best friends. Don't worry about anything else. I will help you. He established 70 polis, 70 cities in Persia. And in each polis, they had a gymnasium, they had temples, they had schools, they had libraries, they had all the advantages of a Greek polis. So if anybody from Persia wanted to go, they went to the polis, no problem. He studied Greek. And then if you wrote a book, you wrote it in the book in Greek. So it's this kind of discussion and creation in the 30 or so, 300 years that this Alexandrian age lasted, that we are the product of that age, because the library in Alexandria, the library in Alexandria had 500,000 manuscripts. And according to experts, we have only 1% of that 500,000 manuscripts today, because the good Christians, as I will explain, burned them down. Here we have a couple of words about the great geometrician and mathematician Euclid. I studied the elements when I was in high school. Here is Aristarchus of Samos, who developed the theory of the heliocentric system. And of course, this is the giant in mathematics and metallurgy and technology in general, Archimedes of Syracuse from Sicily. He was just on his own. He developed several fields of scientific knowledge. He was far ahead of anybody for the last 2,000 years. And even today, he's very challenging to read and understand what he did. And then eventually all that knowledge was incorporated into the building of this machine. This is an astronomical computer called the Antikythera mechanism. I wrote a book about this in 2021. At any rate, it's a fantastic astronomical mechanism predicting the eclipse of the sun and the moon to the hour of the day. And how they did it, it's in other words, they were very advanced in astronomy, in engineering, in mathematics. And then there was a guy, Hipparchus, the greatest Greek astronomer. He had his laboratory in the island of Rhodes, and that's where we suspect he put together this Antikythera mechanism. And the Antikythera mechanism helped quite a bit. It helped to the people to understand the cosmos. And it also provided a way to know when these major divinities, the sun and the moon, the sun and the moon were not just stars like we call them, they were gods to the Greeks. So they had to know why suddenly these major stars disappear from the sky. So it was a terrifying experience. In the Peloponnesian War in 413, something like this happened. That is, there was a lunar eclipse, and suddenly the war came to an end. And the priest in the army demanded that the major general, Nicias, stops everything and for 15 days does all the liturgical and theological and all the other stuff that they had to do to appeal to Selene and to the moon. And of course, the enemies of Athens took advantage of that. They defeated them. They slaughtered them. Athens lost 40,000 people, 40,000 soldiers in this expedition. This is another astronomer, Ptolemaeus, who advanced geometry, science, geography, mathematical physics. And his books triggered the work of Galileo Galilei and then Newton. Here is what the early Christians did. They wiped out Greece. And forgive me if I offend anybody, but this is a fact. And I'm not a propagandist. I'm sticking to the data. Whatever really happened, I mention it. On the very left picture, you can see a young lady there. She's Hypatia. She's a philosopher. She has her own school in Alexandria. She was teaching Platonic and Aristotelian philosophy. And that happened in 415. Monks grabbed her and tore her to pieces. 415. And then we have, of course, the face here is a beautiful face of Aphrodite, and you can see what they did. They defaced it. I took a picture. I took this picture in the museum in Athens. When I saw it 2-3 decades ago, I went to the guard that was close. I said, "Hey, can you please tell me who did this?" He said to me, "Young man, you need to talk to the director." At any rate. This is Christianity in the Western Europe and Eastern Europe. On the very left, the second picture from that, you have Justinian. He was the emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire, of the Greek medieval state. And he shut down the Platonic Academy that had been a university for 900 years. It tells you something. And some of the Greek knowledge survived, like the Greek fire that was a war weapon. And of course, then you have the wars that happened on the name of Christ. This gentleman from Italy, that is Venetians, French, and Germans, instead of going to Jerusalem to free the city from the Muslims, they went to Constantinople and they grabbed it. They burned the libraries. They did all sorts of atrocities. They divided the country into pieces, and they prepared the war for the Mongol Turks in 1453. Unfortunately, that's what happens. This is the Fourth Crusade. I cite this distinguished English historian who claims Constantinople, with all its problems, he was a kind of a ray of light, and he was correct. And of course, this is the Fourth Crusade, 1204. This man is of extreme, very great importance. He used to be a metropolitan, and he joined the Pope, trying to unite the two churches, East and West, and they managed to do that a few years before the Turkish onslaught. And the Pope made him a cardinal, and he brought the largest library of Greek manuscripts to the West, that is to Padua, Venice, but especially Venice. And he donated his library to Venice. They translated those manuscripts into Latin, and then you have the Greek Renaissance in the West. Here is the Turkish onslaught on Constantinople, 1453. The fall of Constantinople was a calamity. There's no doubt about that. And now I'm going to modern times. I'm in early 19th century right now as we speak. And this guy on the right side, I wrote my PhD thesis on him. So I know a little bit about him. The title of this is called Nomarchia, means the rule of law. And in this book, he describes, of course, the ancient Greek traditions of law and legislation and why you need law, the rule of law, and so on. And at the same time, describe the life of the Greeks that were under Mughal rule, and it was horrendous. His books, he started editing Aristotle. He edited Hippocrates. He was a medical doctor, but he never practiced medicine. But he edited Hippocrates. He wrote his PhD at the University of Montpellier. And he also edited the works of Plutarch. And those books that he edited with lengthy introductions went to the Greek schools, and the Greek students and the teachers read them. And I consider him to be the father of the Greek Revolution of 1821. He spoke about freedom, and this is what he says about freedom. And he's right. There's nothing you can do without freedom. Nothing, absolutely nothing. And here I have a letter from Thomas Jefferson writing a letter to Corais, October 31, 1823. Thomas Jefferson was in Paris as an ambassador. He's telling Corais, look, in this letter, he's telling him that the study of your ancient ancestors is the best preparation for the revolution. And number two, not only that, but for us, it helped us to get rid of the Gothic darkness. That's how he called it, Gothic darkness in the United States. So there were a lot of people who loved the Greeks. And here is the beginning of the Greek Revolution. The institution that they developed, it was secret, and they developed in Odessa, Russia. So you have ancient Greece, Russia, and the study of the ancient Greeks that really helped the modern Greeks to finally decide freedom or death. And they defeated the Turks. This is the Greek Revolution. I will speed up. I mean, this is all very important, but we have to keep going. On the left, here we have money raised for the Greek struggle of independence. You see, the Greek independence happened in 1821. 1821, Europe, by that time, was controlled by England, Russia, and France. And they had developed a sacred alliance against anybody revolting. So you can imagine how they reacted to the Greek Revolution. But nevertheless, they saw the courage and the sacrifice and the victories, and they said, wait a second, we have to do something about what's happening now. And they did. Here you have Lord Byron in Mesologia, in a Greek city in central Greece. And he, of course, 3 months later, he died. He went to Mesologia, he died 3 months later. But all the struggles and sacrifices and atrocities of the Turks created Philhellenism, meaning a love for Greece. In fact, you had many Europeans who went there and volunteered and fought with the modern Greeks against the Turks that had been trained, armed to the teeth by Europeans. I mean, this is something that the modern Greeks will never forget. I can guarantee you that. And there was, as a result of all these atrocities, finally the European powers decided we have to do something about it. So they sent their fleets in Navarino, southern Peloponnesus. They smashed the Turkish-Egyptian fleet in October 1827, and that was the first step for Greek independence. The next step was Russia attacked Turkey, defeated Turkey, and in the Treaty of Adrianople, 1829, there was a clause that Greece is going to be independent. So that's the beginning of Greek independence, and that the great powers appointed this guy, Ioannis Kapodistrias. He used to be a genius in diplomacy, despite the fact that he was trained as a doctor. And he was the Secretary of State of Russia from 1816 to 1822. So he knew what was going on in Europe. And he tried to get the Russians, Alexander, to really help the revolution. But Alexander I was committed to this other Europeans. So he said, do what you can, but don't ask me to start another war. But anyway, his enemy, he had a lot of enemies. He went to Greece. Greece was in ruins. He used his own money plus money from Swiss Philhellenes. They sent him money, and he used that money to create a tiny form of a Greek state, that is some bureaucracy, to define the borders, to create schools, to create hospitals, to do something about what the Greek state should have. And unfortunately, because of that, he stepped on a lot of toes, both Greek and foreign. And the British, for instance, they hated him. They called him a tyrant. Including Corais, that I wrote my thesis, he called him a tyrant because he was getting the wrong information in Paris. He was working in Paris rather than in Greece. And they eventually murdered him on September 27, 1831. And after the death of this man, modern Greece has been in trouble ever since. Freedom or death. We have a Greek general here. So this guy, he's a general, and he learned how to write Greek in the age of 35. He wrote his memoirs, and I have read the memoirs. His memoir says this. Look, he's addressing the Europeans. He said, look, our ancestors gave you virtues, dressed you in virtues. And what do you do in return? You're trying to corrupt us. Each time we defeat the Turks, what do you think you do? You go and you supply them with food and ammunition. He said, if you minded your own business, you left us alone, we would have been already free. But that's what the Europeans did, unfortunately. And then they brought the German king. I'm against monarchy. I just don't think that a monarch, one dictator or one king can take care of a state. I mean, it's just too much corruption. And especially bringing a foreign Goth king into Greece, it's just a contradiction in terms. Now we come to 1820s. This is after World War I. The Europeans wanted the Greeks to go to Smyrna. They went to Smyrna. They were welcomed here. And this is on the left, the map of what they had in mind to take over. They wanted to pretty much conquer all what is today Turkey. That used to be Greece, by the way. And in that process, there were terrible mistakes. And they had incompetent politicians in Athens. And at the same time, the great powers, as we said, Italy, England, France, and who else? Russia, who was already a communist country. Remember Soviet Union? It was already a Soviet Union. They look at the petroleum in Mosul, Iraq. And who controlled that? The Turks. So they were courting this military general in Turkey, Kemal Atatürk, for the petroleum. So they abandoned the Greeks, and they lost the war. It was a calamity. The Greeks to this very day call this the Great Catastrophe. And here is the burning of Smyrna, which was a Greek city for millennia. And then now we come to World War II. You can see the Germans. The Germans were the barbarians of barbarians. I'm sorry to say that, but that's what they did. They were fantastic in destruction. I mean, they destroyed 1,700 villages. They killed who knows how many people. They surrounded the cities. They would not allow anybody to bring food or to come in. So you had massive number of people dying of starvation in the cities every day. It was a horrific experience. Here, and finally, we come to the last 20 years of this century. That is from 2009, 10 to 2020. The Obama administration primarily. Regrettably, Obama administration allowed the IMF, which is the International Monetary Fund, that belongs to the Secretary of Treasury, to screw Greece, literally, to really punish Greece. Those officials, plus the officials of the EU, meaning European Union, they treated Greece like an enemy state. They confiscated all the state properties, assets. They gave the railroads to the Italians. They gave the airports and telephone to Germany. They gave the Chinese the largest harbor of Greece in Piraeus. So, I mean, if you go to Greece, you don't see any of what I'm saying. Everything looks normal. But underneath that normalcy, there's tremendous anger because the average Greek citizen knows about all these things. And the Greek government in power is nothing else but kind of a servant of the foreigners. I mean, so there's no political independence. And then you have the Turks that hated the Greeks all these years, and they continue to do so, threatening to grab the Aegean Sea with all the islands. And what does the United States do? Nothing. So it's a complicated question. Here I have another book coming out in 2-3 months about global warming. And the reason I mention it, not just for advertisement, but because some of the questions I'm raising already will be continued to be raised in this book, not about necessarily about the Greeks, but about the political applications of Greek knowledge in this climate we face. And despite the efforts of this administration to say there's no global warming, regrettably they're dead wrong. And in fact, in a 2023 document, US government document, they say that this country is warming at 68% faster than any other country on earth. So you think about that and see what I mean. The lessons of Greek history, of course, you have a democracy idea, never to live in slavery or on your knees, to demand freedom and to exercise the rule of law, and to be independent and free. Freedom, as I said, is the food and water and breathing the oxygen of everything that we do. Without freedom, we cannot survive. And oh, I have two good news, finally. Here is from John Burnett, who's a British historian of philosophy or something like this. He writing in 1920, and this is what he says. Science is thinking about the world in the Greek way. That is why science have never existed except among people who have come under the influence of Greece. And I agree with him. And the other very positive point is about the continuity of the Greek people. No matter the conqueror, they have managed to survive, and they are one people. This comes from the magazine Science in a 2017 study, which you cannot see right now, but says the Greeks do really have near mythical origins. The Minoans were related to the Mycenaeans, and both were related to modern Greeks. And here we are, and I thank you very much, and I'm be happy to answer questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Evaggelos. Very, very much.
My pleasure.
So you've given us a whirlwind tour through the history of Greece.